this talk is part of a broader project where I argue that we as philosophers and psychologists have been kind of missing a key cognitive capacity in the mind, valuation. The mind is in the business of doing something that we haven't really appreciated, or that has been underappreciated. And so that's the idea that, the mind values, that the mind is evaluative in nature. And then within this kind of bigger research project that I will be continuing at DeepMind, there comes up this debate with people in predictive processing who say, hey, Julia, that's nice, but that's just a kind of bit of useless architecture that we don't need. We can take all of the good stuff that you have or that you attribute to valuation, and we can reduce it to attention. So the focus of today's talk is kind of nested around this smaller argument that I'm having with people in predictive processing. So that's just kind of the framework there. And again, because I can't see you, and because we have a fair amount of time, in case something's not clear, it may make sense to just jump in and ask in the process, just so we kind of, because I can't see your faces, I can't judge if something's, if there's something awry. So to kind of frame the general picture, right, there's a roughly new approach to understanding the nature of motivation, choice, and action in cognitive science. And roughly this new approach explores the nature of motivation in terms of what's known as the learning problem. So this approach asks how an agent can learn to optimize its behavior strictly from interactions with its environment. So to take a very basic example, here you have a picture of a baby plover, and we know the baby plovers, within a matter of hours of being born, can learn to walk, they can learn to fly, they can seek out food, and they can avoid predation and so on. And with all due respect to, parent plover over here in the picture, they roughly do that all on their own. They just sort of do that by bumping around in the little world that they're born into. And the question that this approach asks is, okay, how do agents like that, how does the baby plover, how do humans learn to do that? They learn to kind of live a pretty decent life just by kind of trial and error. And very roughly, research in this area known as reinforcement learning takes these questions and idealizes them. So it analyzes idealized versions of kind of the plover problem, and then it develops formal, or in other words, algorithmic mathematical solutions to them. So it takes, let's say, the world of the baby plover, and it reduces this to these kinds of grid worlds, state spaces, and it says, okay, how can the agent pair states and actions in ways that allow it to then kind of maximize its well-being. So it really strips everything back, and then it develops formal solutions to, what the best way of moving through this grid world is, so that it can seek out food, let's say, or avoid predation pitfalls of all kinds. And, this view originates kind of in computer science in the late 80s and early 90s. And then in the mid to late 1990s, it kind of takes off and moves just beyond computer science into what we might call the decision sciences, computational neuroscience, psychology, neuroeconomics. And it kind of becomes this sort of burgeoning field, although it hasn't impacted philosophy as much. And, is in some ways kind of a dominant approach to understanding questions of motivation and choice. And I think one of the strengths of the view, or the reasons for its success, is that although the solutions, as I just mentioned, are kind of normative in nature, they ask how do agents like the plover optimally solve for this problem, it turned out that they were very predictive and explanatory when it came to a wide range of empirical findings and practical applications. So as some of you may be familiar, right, one of these algorithms, the temporal difference learning algorithm, came to predict dopaminergic firing in the brain. Of course, there are some widgets that we might want to add to that characterization, but roughly how things we thought would be best solved turned out to tell us a lot about how things actually work in brains like ours, and also to kind of very successfully guide all kinds of artificial intelligence like AlphaGo and so on. And so all of a sudden it kind of moved beyond just a theoretical approach, and people got excited and said, hey, this really seems to catch on to something. It seems to work well. And so these mathematical models started informing all kinds of approaches in the empirical sciences. And increasingly also we're seeing informal or non-computational accounts from, or principles from reinforcement learning playing a role in theorizing. So what I mean by that is that For example, in philosophy and psychology, increasingly we're seeing some of the concepts that originate in reinforcement learning start to play a role, for example, in the philosophy of mind. So one example of that that many of you are probably familiar with is Tim Schroeder looking to the work of computational neuroscience and saying something like, hey, we can adapt these principles and have something new to say about the nature of desire in the philosophy of mind. So we kind of see this kind of diffusion of these ideas from the mathematical all the way to the philosophical. And kind of at a minimum, you might say, okay, these are markers of scientific success, or what Kitcher would call, scientific fecundity. There's something going on here, and it's worth looking at. It's at least worth knowing about. In my work, I argue for something a little bit stronger, which is that it's not just kind of a coincidence that all these domains work so well in intersection, and that all these fields find these methods so productive. I argue that this productivity occurs because these models and findings all actually target a common cause. So they actually capture something about the nature of the world and about the nature of the mind in particular. And I argue that this common cause is actually a discrete cognitive capacity. So it's something that the mind is doing. It captures something that the mind is doing. And as you might guess from kind of the title of my talk, that cognitive capacity is valuation, which is, very roughly, we're going to refine this definition as we go, but roughly valuation is the subjective attribution of reward and value. So I argue that all of these methods are onto something because the mind is actually in the world, in the business of saying, that's better, that's worse, and kind of overlay these fabrics of reward and value over our experiences, and they in turn guide what we do, what we choose, what we prefer, and so on. So that's kind of the bigger project or picture that I mentioned. And of course, you might right off the bat notice that, this is going to be not necessarily strictly at odds with received views, but it's going to bump up against some views that we traditionally hold in philosophy. Perhaps most obviously, if you're positing a new cognitive capacity, you're going to want to revise the old cognitive taxonomy. So if you take something like Susan Hurley's classical sandwich, which is the idea that, we just have perception, cognition, and action, or if you just want to add memory and affect and a couple of other things in there, we're going to want to sort of make room for a new cognitive capacity in there and understand how it relates to all the other capacities that we think are already part of that picture. Kind of consistent with the Tim Schroeder idea, right? We're going to want to revise perhaps some philosophical folk psychological concepts that we have. I worked on that, for example, with weakness of will, but kind of more generally, something like the notion of motivation or the notion of desire might get a bit refined or revised in light of this valuational picture. And perhaps most kind of closely, maybe the closest or most obvious, rival view to something like a reinforcement learning-based approach is predictive processing in philosophy. So that's another kind of computationally informed or sort of formally friendly approach, which of course suggests that all the mind is in the business of doing is minimizing prediction error. And so, reinforcement learners are going to say, hey, no, you need this added variable of reward, and predictive processors are going to say, no, you don't. The mind is just in the business, at bottom is just in the business of sort of information processing in this way. And so in this debate with the predictive processors comes the specific challenge that I mentioned that's going to kind of guide the rest of this talk, which is this idea that I argue that valuation is a discrete cognitive capacity, a sui generis cognitive capacity, and they're going to argue, no, we don't need this. Valuation is just kind of attention, and what you're suggesting is just this extra or empty wheel in the cognitive ontology. So this is kind of the objection to kind of my view, and the one that I'm going to take on in the remainder of the project, or in the remainder of the talk, I should say. So I'm going to deny this, right? So kind of the rough structure of the talk for the remainder is, in three parts. One, very briefly, this is going to be the briefest part of the talk. I'm going to kind of give you a sketch of my defense for evaluation as a sui generis cognitive capacity. I'm going to move through this part the most quickly, but I'm happy to talk much more about it in Q&A. I just, from what Bensei had suggested, I think there's a lot of interest in things like perception and binocular rivalry. So that's what I'm going to really focus on in the second section. this debate between valuation and attention, or between me and the predictive processors, kind of comes up in its most prominent, not prominent, but most salient form in discussions of perception, and particularly binocular rivalry. So there I'll kind of give some context for where the debate arises between us, my explanation of the phenomena, their explanation of the phenomenon, where they make the reductive argument, and then I'm going to defend myself against their view and also provide arguments where I think valuation and attention are actually separate capacities. And then finally, and depending on kind of how much time there is and if people have questions along the way, I'm going to suggest that if you do kind of buy what I'm selling in the first two parts of the talk, if you do dissociate between valuation and attention, then that's actually kind of a productive way of going forward. I'm going to argue that but they operate kind of hand in glove, and that if that's right, you can actually use what we know about valuation to inform the philosophical and psychological study of attention in ways that can be really useful. So kind of putting the positive view on the table, but again, I'm going to move through this part fairly quickly unless questions. So to kind of understand the notion of valuation, there are kind of two basic concepts that we want to get pretty clear on because they're going to inform everything that we're going to talk about, and those are reward and value, respectively. It's important to understand the relationship between the two. So reward in this literature is defined as the intrinsic desirability of a given stimulus. And for example, my classic illustration of this is that I, Julia, find, a cappuccino like profoundly rewarding in the morning, particularly when I'm trying to get up. But, here I mentioned I'm in Canada, it's cold, it's dark, it's pretty crappy. And, getting out of bed, grinding the coffee, getting the coffee maker ready. None of those states or state action pairs are rewarding at all. In fact, they're horrible. And I try to shove them off onto someone else as much as possible. But those state action pairs are valuable insofar as they lead to the cup of coffee. So value here is the total expected future reward associated with a given stimulus. So reward is something that's intrinsically desirable. I'll say more about the sense of intrinsic there in a second. I like coffee, and even very miserable things that lead to the coffee are valuable because of the relationship that they have to this final stimulus. So we can kind of build on this to give a more developed characterization of valuation than the one that I gave in the introduction. So I characterize valuation as the subpersonal attribution of goal and context dependent subjective reward and value to either interoceptive or exteroceptive stimuli. Now I realize that's not the most attractive definition on the face of the earth, but it's worth just unpacking what each of those parts is doing there. It's subpersonal. All that's meant to say there is that it's a causal mechanism. I realize that for many people that's kind of a weasel word. Sorry, Rob Rupert. All I'm trying to flag there is that when we talk about valuation, we're not talking about values. We're not talking about political values. In the personal level sense, these are not things that you knowingly or deliberatively form. This is something that your mind or brain is doing kind of in a causal or mechanical way. Reward and value are both goal and context dependent. So here's where that notion of sort of intrinsically desirable comes in. The coffee is rewarding to me if my goal is to wake up in the morning, and if my context is, when I first get out of bed. If I'm trying to go to sleep and it's late at night, it's no longer rewarding to me. So it's a fairly fluid definition of something that's intrinsically desirable, even to me in a subjective sense. And finally, the stimuli here is deliberately meant to be kind of a catch-all. In the classic reinforcement learning frameworks, we attribute reward and value to states and pairs. Neuroeconomics has since expanded that to show that we attribute reward and value to objects, and particularly economic commodities, tea versus coffee. We attribute reward and value to internal states of affairs, motivational states, like that. And I have actually increasingly argued, and this maybe goes beyond a little bit the empirical, not the empirical evidence, but the theoretical literature and the decision sciences themselves, that we as humans, and this is something that perhaps distinguishes us from other reward-driven critters, is we attribute reward and value to abstract ideas. So we might actually attribute reward or value to the notion of something like fair trade or to vegetarian in itself, rather than just the commodity itself. That's perhaps a bit controversial. Happy to say more about that in the Q&A. So basically, the idea here is that the mind is in the business of saying, hey, that's good. Hey, those are the things that you need to do to get to the good or bad thing. And just to kind of flag, right, that I'm increasingly going to be speaking in kind of philosophical terms, but everything that I've said so far and what I'm going to be saying can be characterized across these multiple interdependent theoretical domains. I'm deliberately avoiding levels talk because I know levels talk is triggering for some people. You can think of these things as levels if you'd like, but we can characterize everything I've said in computational or mathematical terms, as I said, in cellular or systems neuroscientific terms, so in terms of dopaminergic firing or the reward system, if you prefer that, cognitive science and neuroeconomics, so reward signaling in the brain or willingness to pay, kind of more general terms, and then again in comparative and cognitive psychology and in language like model-free and model-based learning, things like that. So kind of trying to emphasize that these are kind of interconnected and that they have kind of a rich base of characterization and all the evidence that goes with them. The other thing that I want to flag is that, or kind of the empirical claim that I want to make, I should say, is that valuation is ubiquitous in minds like ours. So valuation plays a role across a wide range of psychological capacities. And just to kind of illustrate that for you, I'll give you one kind of low example. So for example, we can take the case of visual fixation. So visual fixation is the problem of where to look, or what to look at, when, and in what order. And we've known for a long time that human beings are really good at this. We kind of look at things just in time, but we haven't known exactly what systems in the brain guide this sophisticated process. You can see here on the left side of your slide, this is of course an eye tracking task. I think the participant was asked to make something like a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and then the researchers were looking at what the participants were looking at and when. You should just notice a couple of things. I know the picture's a little bit small there, but a couple of things to notice. So kind of how efficiently the participants are looking at the plate, the bread, the knife, the peanut butter, and so on. But it's just as important to kind of notice what they're not looking at, right? They're not looking around the rest of the room. And most importantly, I think for what we're going to talk about later, they're not looking at the salient tablecloth at all, right? It's just irrelevant. So we know we're really good at looking at things, and we're good at looking at them in the right order. And increasingly, we have quite a bit of evidence that what guides what we look at and when, and how we learn over time when we learn new skills, for example, what guides this process of fixation and saccadic eye movement is valuation. So take the improbable example of my making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich for the first ever time. Let's say I'm from Mars, or I've lived on Mars. I'm a human, but I've lived on Mars my whole life, and I've never made a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. The kind of going theory of how valuation informs the process, what I look at and when, is that we have a process of retroactive attribution of reward and value. So I don't attribute much value to looking at the toast or the plate or the peanut butter the first time that I'm going through. But upon the rewarding experience of eating the peanut butter and jelly sandwich, I then retroactively attribute value to the states of looking at the various stages that then consequently led to my eating the peanut butter and sandwich. So we're constantly attributing value backwards based on the experiences that we have over the course of our lives. And perhaps one kind of intuitive way of thinking about this is, if you've ever seen a newborn baby, you'll have noticed that their visual fixation patterns are kind of trash. Like, they look all over the place and they're not looking at anything in particular, right? They are, mass exploration versus exploitation. They're just looking all over the place. But very quickly, they learn to look at the things that lead to their food, right, to their nutrition, to milk or formula. And this often gets interpreted as like, oh, you're looking at your parents' face, and so on and so forth. And of course, to some extent they are, but they're primarily working backwards from that kind of jackpot of the food, and they learn to kind of look for the signs that lead to what they're going to eat. And this roughly kind of, if you expand this out over the course of our lives, guides what we look at. And conversely, if you see an expertise, for example, Cristiano Ronaldo, what he looks at, very far ahead. So the reward system kind of informs what we look at and when, based on these complex webs of reward and value. Now, kind of, that was a very low-level example, and again, this is an empirical claim. I'm happy to say much more about this in the Q&A, but I argue that valuation plays this role, this guiding role, in sensation and perception. We'll talk much more about that in what comes next, and attention, but also in perspective memory, in memory in general, cognitive control, decision making, and all the way to these so-called kind of high-level capacities like moral decision making. So I argue that what you're doing when you're saying, hey, I just didn't like what you're doing there, or, you know, hey, I'm going to buy this fair trade coffee versus this not fair trade coffee, is you're using this exact same system of attributing reward and value to kind of make snap moral decisions. Now, it would take forever to kind of defend each one of these. Again, I'm happy to say more about this in the Q&A. I think the evidence is there, but one way of thinking about it is in reverse. If you take individuals, for example, with Parkinson's disease, who have major deficits in their valuation systems, right? The dopaminergic system is breaking down. You will see deficits not only in the kind of classic motor control, but you will see deficits in sensation, perception, attention, perspective memory, corresponding mood disorders, difficulty with moral decision making. So there's kind of this spine of capacities. It doesn't include all of our capacities, not language or word selection. Many things are not guided by these systems, but this kind of spine of capacities that seems to break down together in a way that would be hard to account for if it didn't have this common cause of valuation or the reward systems. So that's the claim. We've been missing something. You know, we've been attributing a lot to affect or to the emotions, and in fact, there's something kind of additional alongside our beliefs and our affects, our reasons and affect, and it's this evaluative capacity that's in a way a bit of those capacities combined. So that's kind of the broad project, and zipping through that fairly quickly. The challenge comes, right, is, you know, if someone comes along and says, well, we just don't need that, then that's a pretty big problem from my view. So the kind of the hump of the talk, right, is valuation just attention? Can we reduce all of this? And just to kind of give you a bit of structure in the second section, as I mentioned, here's where we're kind of getting into a bit of detail. I'll start by giving a bit of context about kind of where the specific debate comes up in the context of binocular rivalry. I'll suggest why I think binocular rivalry is kind of grist for my value. I'll give you kind of a specific objection, right? This idea from predictive processors that they can do away with everything that I'm suggesting, and that they can just reduce valuation to attention. I'll criticize that view. And then the last kind of subsection of this second part of the talk, in addition to saying like, hey, I think their arguments are crappy, those are not good grounds for, you know, positing the existence of something. I'll give, you know, positive reasons for why I think valuation and attention should be kept separate. So kind of the backdrop, right? And as Bensei mentioned, you guys may be interested in binocular rivalry, so hopefully this kind of digs more specifically into some of the stuff that you guys are working on. So probably don't need to say that to this room, but binocular rivalry, of course, occurs when you show one stimulus to one eye, and at the same time, kind of with some kind of division between them, you show another stimulus to the other eye. In this case, a house and a face are the easiest ones to describe. And the resulting experience is kind of surprising because what you actually perceive is house, face, house, face, house, face, right? One piece of kind of technical terminology that'll be useful going forward is this idea of perceptual dominance. So perceptual dominance is either the percept that you experience first, reliably first, or the percept that you see for longer periods of time or occurs more frequently over the period of alternation. So I see both of them, but I tend to see the house for longer periods of time. That's perceptual dominance. Now, Jacob Howie and colleagues have kind of, argued for the importance of binocular rivalry. It's obviously an interesting case study for theories of perception because, you're perceiving something that you're clearly not actually seeing. If you want to, you're being presented with one thing and perceiving another. And they have a nice breakdown of kind of what a good theory of perception should be able to account for. They break it down into two problems, selection and alternation. So the selection problems are twofold. The first question is, why do you see an individual percept rather than a group or kind of amalgamation? So why do I see a face or a house rather than a house face? That's question number one. Question number two is, the individual versus individual selection problem. Why do I see the house or the face? And then finally, third, and maybe most puzzlingly, right, the alternation problem. Why do I see an alternation between the two? Even if, I see one or the other, that still doesn't necessarily explain why they should alternate between them in these strange ways. Now, hierarchical predictive coding is going to give a very, I think, elegant and compelling solution to this problem. Again, I'm assuming that to this room, don't need to explain this in much detail, just kind of zip through it, right? Just hierarchical predictive coding is this idea that everything about perception that we've thought is wrong, and what the mind is in the business of doing is not kind of just taking in inputs and reconstructing them, but rather it's making predictions about our sensory inputs in the world, and so it kind of makes guesses or has hypotheses about what we are going to see. And then the bottom up part of the equation is really rather prediction error. So where the input doesn't align with the predictions, rather than getting kind of coarse input from the external world, all we're getting are these prediction errors. And what the mind is constantly in the business of doing is trying to reduce these prediction errors. So it's updating its predictions to sort of see the world more accurately. So sometimes described as, sort of the controlled hallucination picture of perception. So another kind of technical term that's just useful, just so we have it all on the table, is this notion of precision. So precision is kind of a measure of noise, bottom up component of the input. So for example, in human beings, visual input is typically thought to have a very high degree of precision. We're sort of very vision-driven creatures. As compared to, let's say, our auditory input. But of course, if you turn the lights off or it becomes dark, the precision of our visual input is dramatically reduced, particularly relative to our auditory input, which then is increased. So it's just kind of a marker of how much we should weigh those prediction errors. If I'm in the dark and there's a strong prediction error, I could probably disregard it because it's very noisy. If I have a robust prediction error in broad daylight, that's something that the system can kind of quote unquote take seriously. And if you're someone like Jacob Howie, part of the appeal of this view is that it's arguably guided or consistent with kind of normative Bayesian principles of inference, right? So that if it's consistent with Bayes' rule, the updating occurs in this sort of normatively consistent way. And of course, again, as I mentioned at the outset, when you have a normative or mathematical principle of how things ought best to work, and then you find them in the natural world, be that in biology or physics, it's always going to be exciting. And so that's part of the appeal of the hierarchical predictive coding view, I think. It is genuinely kind of appealing. And I think in particular, this solution to, what's going on in binocular rivalry is kind of cool. Like, it's legitimately cool. So why do you see an individual image or percept rather than a combination of the two? The idea is that, we're not very much in the business of seeing house faces in the world. So I'm not very likely to make the prediction, okay, that's a house face. And so I make the prediction that it's a face or a house rather than a house face because I don't have a lot of priors for seeing house faces in the world. So that's the individual versus group selection. Individual versus individual selection is going to be dependent on what kind of those are basically different between something like a house and a face, but if you give people binocular rivalry between something like a dog and a seahorse, most people will tend to have perceptual dominance for the dog because they see a lot more dogs in their everyday experiences than they do seahorses. If you take a marine biologist, of course, they might be reversed and so on. And then really kind of the neat part of this explanation is when it comes to alternation. So the idea is something like the mind posits, okay, I predict that it's going to be a house, but then the prediction error is like, well, you're only accounting for half of what's actually being, presented here. So it switches to the other percept to try and kind of accommodate for that prediction error. It's doing a pretty good job, but it's not accommodating the other half of kind of the incoming input. So it tries to switch again, and then that results in the famous phenomenon that is alternation in binocular rivalry. Okay, that's cool. I think most people, when they read that explanation, they're like, that's pretty nifty. Of course, it has since also kind of become a proof of concept for predictive coding itself. When you say, I think predictive coding is what the mind is doing, one of the classic examples that you point to across the board, even in active inference and action, all kinds of things, is this example of binocular rivalry, and you can see why, because it's kind of cool. But if you're someone like me, and way back when in 2018, you're kind of invited to give a talk criticizing predictive coding, you have to come up with a way to kind of burst that bubble. And if you're someone like me and you're a proponent of reinforcement learning, you think, okay, hey, there must be something that this kind of simple model, as elegant and neat as it is, can't accommodate. And again, if you have worked in something like visual fixation and the role of reward there, you think, okay, well, if it's true in visual fixation, it's probably true in perception too, and you start digging around. And lo and behold, you find that value or reward plays a role in binocular rivalry. So kind of the first and most basic paradigm that's hopefully going to cause problems for the predictive code is this paradigm where you train participants to recognize certain stimuli as being rewarded. So you tell them every time you see a picture of a face, you're going to get another 50 cents added to your final total. Train them on this, they see faces, and then you put them into a binocular rivalry setting, and you ask them which percept is dominant, what do they see first, or what do they see more often, and unsurprisingly, they are going to see the rewarded stimulus more often, or it's going to be perceptually dominant in binocular rivalry. Now, you're thinking, okay, that could be motivated reasoning. They did try and control for like lying just to make money, but you could still say there are ways around that. So in the kind of more sophisticated paradigm, what you have is a rewarding of the percepts themselves rather than the stimuli before the rivalry takes place. So what you do here is you don't tell them anything in advance. You just have them report what percept they're experiencing, right? And then every time they say, hey, I'm seeing the red blob, you make a kind of ka-ching sound, like ka-ching, money is being dropped into your account. And again, here the idea is to control for kind of motivated responding, but again, what you will find in rewarded percepts is that the rewarded percept is perceptually dominant over time. So actually here you can see the diagram doesn't quite line up because I'm rewarding the red one and the blue one seems to occur more often over a longer period of time. But you have the general idea. If you're rewarding the red one, it's perceptually dominant over the course of the alternation. Again, if you're a predictive coder, you're like, okay, that's not great, but maybe what's going on here is that reward is just a piece of information. I just know more about the rewarded percept, and so by expectations, that should maybe lead me to perceive it more often. This last paradigm kind of create some challenges for that interpretation, because if you take the same paradigm with responding to percepts, but you punish a certain percept. So for example, every time someone says, I'm seeing the blue dot, you make a da-da, like you're taking money out of their account, rather than having those be perceptually dominant, as you would on the kind of information theory. Again, the non-punished percept in this case, it switches. The non-punished percept is perceptually dominant. So it's not just that you know something extra about one of the percepts over the other. It's really and truly, it seems to be the case that the rewarded or the less punished percept is perceptually dominant in all three paradigms. So if you're me and you're trying to write that original talk in 2018, you're like pretty excited. You email a bunch of people, including Carl Friston, and they're like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But of course, they're not going to leave it at that. They're not going to yield to some like random proponent of reinforcement learning. What they're going to do is they're going to kind of pull out what is the kind of crux objection of this talk, right? Which is that, look, that's nice, but reward states are just attention, and we have a perfectly good account of attention in predictive processing. So here's kind of the core argument, right? This core argument reducing rewarded states to attention. Valuation is just attention. Here's the core argument, and you'll see this appeal to but it's not necessarily as explicitly stated as I have it here. You know, this is a reconstruction, but it's, I think, endorsed fairly informally kind of across conversations and across papers that we can do away with reward. So the argument goes like this. Rewarded states are just expected states. Expected states have high precision, and states with high precision are associated with attention. So let's go back to the case of the plover just to kind of see a little bit about what they might mean by that. Rewarded states are just expected states. So you can imagine the baby plover. The baby plover, on some model of its world, kind of expects to see grubs in its environment. It expects to see things that help it survive. And so it's not that they're rewarded, it's just those are the things that it expects to see in its world. And so rewarded states like grubs just are how it's designed to interact with the world. It just expects those things, and so we can reduce rewarded states to expected states. Expected states have high precision. This kind of makes sense, right? If you have a lot of experience with certain kinds of states, or you have high expectations regarding certain states, then it would also correspond that they have high precision. And then again, the third premise is, you know, fairly intuitive, if maybe contestable. States with high precision are associated with attention. So it makes sense to suggest that something like we would attend to the states that have high precision because they're going to be the most reliable ones, right? So rewarded states are expected, expected states are precise, and precise states are the ones we attend to. So rewarded states can just be reduced to attention. And again, you don't need to posit all this extra crap, Julia, that you were trying to suggest that we need. People like Chris Moll and Madeline Ransom have really taken issue with that third premise. I'm just going to set that one aside. For our purposes, I'm going to focus on the first one. And kind of my strategy here, as I mentioned, is to suggest that I don't find this argument compelling. In particular, I don't find the first premise compelling before going on to, you know, have constructive reasons for dissociating valuation and attention. So the first thing you might wonder is, you know, why expect rewarded states? So here, I'll go back this way, right? Why would the baby plover expect grubs over the course of its life? It's just been born, it has no expectations at all. One of the ways that this kind of gets dealt with in a bit more detail is this idea of deep expectations, you know, this idea that we've evolved over the course of our lineages, certain expectations about what you expect in the world, and that's why we come to expect rewarded states. So Andy Clark argues predictions are made on the basis of a generative model, and the generative model we consider as whole and instantiate will have been shaped by both evolution and lifetime learning so as to be the one that ensures we are deeply disposed to predict with high action and training precision the kinds of sensory state that help to keep us alive and viable. Among such deep set predictions, we will find, for example, ones that mandate keeping key features of the bodily plant within tolerable limits. So this is actually kind of, you know, a plausible suggestion. It's not that the baby plover very quickly learns to expect that there are grubs in its world. It's rather that it has, in fact, inherited those expectations from its plover ancestors, and we are sort of designed to expect in certain ways that the world will afford opportunities to survive. Okay, friend I think puts this nicely, right? Why expect reward stays deeply or otherwise. Colin's argument is basically like, look, the world is, pardon my French, just kind of a shitty place, particularly from an evolutionary perspective. You know, I don't wake up thinking the world is just going to kind of hand me grubs on a silver platter. And in fact, from an evolutionary perspective, we should be getting wiped out all the time. What we should be expecting is that the world is a horrible place, and that the world is filled with dangers, and predators they're constantly trying to destroy us. So just on a kind of conceptual level, thinking that we are somehow put into some kind of Eden-like world where we're going to get rewarded and fed and so on is maybe not for the misanthropes among us. Same kind of argument, maybe slightly made more precise, comes from Gershman and Daw, who argue that, look, value and expectation are just going to come apart in unusually good or bad circumstances. So if you take, for example, a wolf, and the wolf hunts down a stag that's bigger than usual, if all it's doing is sort of fulfilling its expectations, it should just eat that part of the stag that it expected, and it should sort of leave the rest, the surplus, aside, right? So it doesn't explain how an organism would take advantage of a windfall like that. That was out of the kind of normal distribution. And so value and expectation are going to want to come apart. But in addition to that, I think you just want to think about, like, okay, even if you grant the deep expectations, where do they come from? If it's been prediction error minimization all along, where did we get those expectations, right? They have to have come and plugged in somewhere. And so I think deep expectations kind of just kicks the problem down the road. Andy Clark thinks so too. And so in his most recent paper, he says, okay, deep expectations are not necessarily satisfactory, but what we can say is that there are webs of expectation. So rewarded states are expected states because all we are these kinds of webs of expectation. So he says, as both our inner states, hunger, thirst, etc., and outer contexts ebb and flow, some predictions enjoy increased precision, becoming positioned to drive immediate actions, while others remain in the background, awaiting the right opportunity to arise, right? So we're kind of these clusters of expectations, and there's this flow, and based on what kind of comes to the fore, if you want to get kind of continental about it, that's what you end up doing, right? So you end up wanting something or approaching something because that's the expectation that's come forward. So he says, right now, for example, it is my high precision prediction that I'm exploring Colin's argument that is selecting my actions, right? Both at the level of looking at various papers to check my claims and then making specific keystrokes, cashing out precise proprioceptive predictions on my computer, right? So this is just the idea of active inference. I have these webs of predictions, and because I'm making them, what I'm trying to do is minimize discrepancies, and so I'm acting in these ways. Because I have a high precision prediction, because Andy has a high precision prediction that he's tussling with Colin's argument, he's trying to make good on that prediction, and that's actually what causes him to be acting in this way. I guess I don't necessarily find this very predictive. I mean, it's one thing to say that, it's kind of an ad hoc explanation, but I think and that's not to be mean here, but it doesn't allow me to make any predictions about what's actually going to happen. I think it's not a very satisfactory explanation of what's already happened in the past, but really I think kind of the rock that this wave breaks on is the fact that it allows me to say nothing about the future. And I think that's a real problem. I think if you're going to weigh something like a reward-based theory and account like this, I'm going to go with the view that allows me to say something about the future based on the reward learning experience that I've had in the past. And Clark kind of just acknowledges that this view doesn't allow that, right? So he says, the skeptic might press the issue, indeed, by asking why a given agent predicts the very things she does with their various weightings. Perhaps she chooses to order tofu rather than chicken for the takeaway. Why did lifetime learning a tofu prediction so as from her colleague's suggestion of chicken? The PP mechanism offers no concrete story here. And I think, okay, that's fine. Maybe that's not what predictive coding is in the business of trying to really explain most broadly. But if it is going to present itself as an alternative of valuation or reward learning more broadly, the concrete story here is going to be kind of important, right? That's kind of how I think we assess competing theories. So that's kind of the critical argument. Now, that said, you know, you don't want to posit a new cognitive capacity based on the fact that you don't really like someone else's argument, or that the argument work necessarily that well. It's very possible that predictive coders will kind of come forward, maybe even in the Q&A, to come kind of bite me in the ass and give a better argument. So I think it's not enough to rely on kind of the negative views, but just very quickly sketch some constructive reasons for dissociating valuation and attention before kind of showing maybe some of the work that this distinction can do. So here I'll just kind of go from 3 brief arguments, going I think from weakest to strongest, looking at the phenomenology, kind of the scope of the capacity, and then the relative function of each. So and if you know me, you probably know this, I don't put a lot of stock in phenomenology in terms of kind of carving up the furniture of the mind, but it's a place to start. So let's just look at kind of why valuation and attention are different. If valuation is associated with any phenomenology whatsoever, it's going to be something like weighing, leaning towards, preference, wanting, approaching, things like that. That's very different than what's traditionally associated with attention. So attention is going to be focusing, spotlighting, accentuating, highlighting. So kind of a zooming in or cutting out rather than a wanting or a leaning in or something like that. And the weakest bit of evidence there, but I think it's worth at least kind of tabling that that's one way to think about it. Maybe a little bit more persuasively, attention, I think, has a kind of very discrete scope. Again, maybe if you take the classical sandwich picture of the mind, it's quite clear like where attention fits into it. I think valuation has a much hazier role. If you buy the kind of valuation as a ubiquitous argument, it has its kind of tentacles in lots of different other cognitive capacities that we take to be well established in the mind. And so just on grounds of scope, if we can say valuation plays a role in attention, as I will do shortly, but it also plays a role in all these other capacities. And so I think on those grounds, maybe again, not ultimately persuasive, but it suggests that there's something else going on between the two, even if they are closely related. But perhaps most importantly, and if it's totally fine if the first two, aren't that compelling to you, but hopefully this will be better. I just think valuation and attention are in the business of doing something else in the mind. So we can recall that valuation is the subpersonal attribution of reward and value. So this attributing of better and worse to the world as we're constantly interacting with it, right? You can start to think of valuation as this kind of casting over of this web of better and worse over our actions, over our commodities, over our interactions, facial expressions. So this attribution, the question is, how does the mind say, good, do that again, right? Whereas attention, across different philosophical views, I think generally has something to do with selectivity, right? It's a state having to do with selectivity, often associated with notions such as focusing. So kind of rather than attributing, it's sort of saying, okay, don't look at that, or selecting what not to look at. And so I think for these reasons, and I'm happy to say more about this in the Q&A, what I'm going to kind of suggest is that valuation and attention will play a kind of hand in glove, or have a kind of hand in glove relation, but they're not going to be the same capacity in the mind, not at all. Okay, so Bente, how much time do I have left?
You really have as much time as you want. It's we're quite flexible, so
okay,
if it takes longer, then let's have this shorter Q&A.
I don't want to kind of kill you all, so I'll just kind of take a few more minutes, but we can kind of go through this probably fairly efficiently. So I've said valuation is a discrete cognitive capacity. I've tried to kind of, in a compressed but hopefully detailed way, argue why, if you're a predictive coder, I see you, I hear you, but I don't buy it, and I think that they're just two separate things altogether. And this is kind of like the proof is in the pudding part of the talk. I was a little bit scared to see Wayne log on at the beginning of this, to suggest like, hey, if this is right, then we can actually use valuation to say some neat things about attention in philosophical but also psychological literatures. And for reasons of time, right, this is just going to be kind of proof by example. So the first example that I'm going to kind of give is, here's how I think that valuation can kind of enrich but not change notion of attention, so it's complementary but not revisionary in any way. The first example is complementary, and the second example is, okay, here's the theory of attention I think we can revise a bit if we take the notion of valuation seriously. So here's the complementary case. So hey Wayne, a kind of prominent theory of attention here is going to be the selection for action view, right? Wayne argues that attention is a solution to the many problem, which is just this idea that we have kind of like a vast or overwhelming number of inputs and then a nearly just as vast potential number of outputs. And what selection is or what attention is, a way of kind of solving that, reducing the many on the input and reducing the many on the thereby the many on the output to kind of allow us to act in the right way in the right time. So here we have the more formal definition. So selection for action, S's attention to X is S's selection of X so as to solve the many problem present to S at T, namely selection of X inherent in S's traversing a specific path in the available behavioral space at T. Now, this is a theory of attention, so saying attention is selection is kind of the floor of this definition, and I think that's fine. That's what the account is, right? It's saying attention is selection. But if you're someone like me, you might think, okay, but how does that selection work? On what grounds? What's the mechanism for selection such that you get attention? And here's where I think the kind of hand-in-glove relation might work. I argue that valuation can be the mechanism for selection. So we get kind of a complementary definition or a sandwich definition, selection for action, 1.0. S's attention to X is S's selection conditional on the subpersonal attribution of goal and context-dependent subjective reward and value to X so as to solve the many problem present to S to T. So what we know why we attend to because we need to solve the many problem. How do we attend to? Because we attend to over these kind of webs or fabrics of reward and value that we have kind of cast over our experiences. So that's kind of the case of the complementary relationship, where I think no revisions need to occur on either side necessarily. It's just what you want if you're kind of adding a cognitive capacity into the taxonomy. You can think of it as like parking an extra car into the parking lot. You really want the car to fit quite nicely with the car that's right next to it. And so I think if you take something like a selection for action view of attention, hey, that actually jives pretty well with what attention in the mind. Again, very briefly, just the second example, which is a bit more revisionary, which says, okay, let's take a different theory of attention and see what valuation might have to say about that. So kind of older versions of this view are something like the spotlight theories of attention, right? What attention is a spotlight that obviously faced a lot of challenges when we showed that you can attend to multiple things at the same time. But I think this idea roughly kind of maybe in a more like respectable way gets carried forward in location theories of attention. So a stimulus's location ultimately determines whether or not that stimulus receives attention, right? So what kind of guides that selection there is where it is in your, let's say, visual field. I think if you take selection seriously, you might start to think that location is actually just a proxy for reward and value. We look to certain things, or we attend to certain things in certain ways in certain places, because typically, though not always, those locations are rewarding or valuable. And here's just a nice throwback from Yarvis, right? What we attend to in faces, it's not because it's the middle of the face that we attend to this kind of classic triangle. It's because of the kind of reward and valuational information that we get in this triangle, that's where we automatically tend to shift our attention. So yes, location plays a role in attention. Location in virtue of the historical in your lifetime and historical in your evolutionary experience proxy for reward and value. Similar idea here with salience, just as a kind of brief aside, the throwback to the checker tablecloth much earlier in the talk. Red is a very salient color for us as human beings. we attend to that. This is getting into just so story territory, but you might think that we tend to attend to things that are red or pay attention to things that are red because in our evolutionary past, they've been highly rewarding, even though, of course, if you have a kid, you know that like red now mostly means sugary trash that your kid should eat. Back when it was fruit, let's say, it might have been a proxy for something a bit more useful to us. And so how does this idea of proxy kind of then revise a kind of existing theory of attention? You have, for example, Pessoa's priority maps account of attention, where he says what we attend to is actually kind of this map based on stimulus salience, endogenous relevance, affective significance, and motivational significance. So kind of starting to put this multi-dimensional idea onto the table. But I think if you take valuation on board, you might think it's actually a bit of a matrix where really a lot of what we're attending to are rewarding and valuable stimuli, where there are also these holdovers into location independently of reward, but that, you know, it's going to be a weighted relationship. It's not completely independent of one another. We look to certain locations because they are typically proxies, not infallibly, but typically proxies for reward and value, and similarly so for salience. Okay, so example of how you might want to tweak a model of attention if you take valuation as an important mechanism for what you look at, when you look at it, what you perceive, and so on. Okay, so just to kind of wrap up here, hopefully just to kind of pull the arc together, you know, a big part of my research is to argue for valuation as a sui generis cognitive capacity, right? This is something that I argue that the mind is doing, and it can really inform different aspects of philosophy of mind. If we seriously, it's going to kind of edge out what we traditionally attribute to emotion in many ways. Then a much more specific claim, right, contra to predictive processing, valuation cannot just be reduced to attention, and it shouldn't be. And if you kind of resist that move, then hopefully we can start to sort of say that valuation can play some kind of constructive in the study of attention. And that's it. Thank you very much.